"You need to change your route," said the voice on the radio. The old bus driver just smiled. "No, I'm exactly where I need to be," he said, and suddenly turned the wheel, because he had seen a gun being aimed at the president's car through the window. And this was his final mission. Welcome to Unsung Valor Stories. Before we begin today's story, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, and if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support us. It was a quiet October morning. The sky was covered with gray clouds, the air slightly misty, the city not yet fully awake. People walked on the sidewalks with hurried steps, coffee cups in hand, eyes on their phones, preparing for the new day. Route 27, connecting the suburbs to the city center, began its first trip at 6:30 a.m. as usual. The large blue city bus slowly pulled away from the station, its engine sound gently breaking the silence. Behind the wheel was 62-year-old Frank Daniels. He had been working the same route for 15 years. Route 27, starting from the east side of the city, passing through the central business district, and extending to the western area where government buildings were located. A 47-stop route. Frank looked like a typical retiree with his gray hair, face lined with sharp creases, and black frame glasses. His navy blue uniform was always ironed, his name tag always in place. Passengers rarely noticed him. For most, he was just a pair of hands holding the steering wheel. But Frank's hands had done much more in his life. Frank's hands had once held guns, loaded bullets with precision. Those hands had protected 3 different presidents, participated in dozens of secret operations, saved countless lives. But now those hands just held a steering wheel, punched tickets, and occasionally, very rarely, gave directions to passengers. At the first stop, 3 passengers boarded: a construction worker, a nurse with tired eyes, and a middle-aged office worker. Frank nodded politely to each of them. He never spoke, never smiled, just did his job. The nurse showed her ticket. "Good morning, Mr. Daniel," she said. Frank nodded. Every day the same passengers, the same greetings, the same silent ritual. As the bus passed through the city's suburbs, it gradually began to fill. By 7 o'clock, there were about 30 passengers, a few workers in the early morning, a couple of students, passengers buried in their phones, disconnected from the world. Frank never talked to any of them, just slightly nodded his head, glanced at the tickets, and continued on his way. Today was no different, or so it seemed. Frank followed the same routine every morning. He got up at 5 a.m., walked on the treadmill for 20 minutes, showered, had breakfast, always the same: 2 eggs, a slice of whole wheat bread, black coffee, put on his uniform and went to work. His colleagues knew him as Mr. Punctual. He never arrived late, never broke the rules, never disrupted his routine. But this morning, Frank had done something different before leaving home. He had opened the secret compartment behind the wardrobe in his bedroom and taken out a small metal box. Inside the box was a photograph, a young Frank standing with 3 men, all in suits, wearing black sunglasses. In the background, a blurry but recognizable image: the White House. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note: "Nighthawk, the mission isn't over. Dart B." Frank had examined the photo carefully as always, then placed it in his pocket. He felt today would be different. He didn't know how, didn't know why, but his instincts were telling him something. And Frank Daniels had learned to trust his instincts a very long time ago. At 7:15, as the bus entered the Elmwood neighborhood, Frank heard a voice on his radio. "All 20 series routes attention. You need to change your route. Mayfield Avenue and Lancaster Boulevard are closed to traffic. I repeat, Mayfield and Lancaster are closed to traffic. Please use alternative routes." Frank had always been procedurally correct. In his 15-year career as a bus driver, he had never violated protocol, never disobeyed an instruction. But this time, he turned off the radio and continued on his regular route. He looked at his passengers in the rearview mirror. None of them had heard the announcement, lost in their headphones. An elderly woman sitting in the front of the bus looked at Frank with concerned eyes. Frank nodded gently as if to say, "Everything is fine." When he turned onto Lancaster Boulevard, he understood why the street was closed. Ahead, about 200 meters away, a convoy was visible. Black SUVs, motorcycle police, and a limousine in the center. The presidential convoy. Frank immediately understood. The president was attending the opening of a new hospital on 4th Avenue today. This was a planned route change, but Frank's instincts were telling him something else. Frank pulled the bus to the side and began to wait. This was standard protocol. All vehicles would wait at the side while the convoy passed. Passengers were looking out the windows curiously. Most people might only get a chance to see a presidential convoy once in a lifetime. But Frank's eyes caught something else. A black van preparing to exit from a side street 50 meters ahead of the convoy. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't have caught his attention. But the van was slowly advancing when it should have stopped at the red light. And the man in the passenger seat had something extending out the window. A gun. At that moment, a switch flipped in Frank's mind. He wasn't a 15-year bus driver anymore. He was someone else. Agent Frank Daniels, Secret Service, Presidential Protection Unit, 1978 to 2004. Frank quickly looked around. The street was relatively empty. A few pedestrians, a couple of cars. Ahead, the convoy was approaching, and that black van was getting closer to the critical point with each passing second. Frank assessed the situation instantly with his experienced eyes. This was an attack. Professional, planned, coordinated. The van probably wasn't the only one. There must be other teams in the area. An urgent voice came through the radio. Number 27, you need to change your route. Allow the convoy to pass and withdraw to the waiting point. I repeat, number 27, withdraw to the waiting point. Frank picked up the microphone, answered in a calm voice. No, I'm exactly where I need to be. Then he dropped the microphone and turned the steering wheel sharply. The city bus with 72 passengers suddenly darted into the middle of Lancaster Boulevard, right in front of the presidential convoy. The convoy stopped abruptly. Protection teams immediately went on alert, but Frank was faster. He positioned the bus right in front of the black van, creating a massive barrier between the convoy and the van. Passengers in the front shouted in surprise. One man yelled, "What are you doing?" Frank didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the man in the passenger seat of the black van. The man had now aimed his weapon at the bus. Just then, the first shot was fired from the passenger seat of the van. The bullet pierced the side window of the bus. Passengers inside began to scream, ducking down. A wave of panic swept through the bus. Frank picked up the microphone, spoke in an extraordinarily calm voice. Please, everyone, lie down. Take cover behind your seats. Stay calm. Secret Service agents are handling the situation. You will be safe. The Secret Service agents had now noticed the situation. They began to surround the van. Armed agents emerged from the SUVs in the convoy, taking strategic positions. But the attackers inside continued to fire. Frank walked calmly through the bus, giving instructions to each passenger individually. Lie down, protect your head, stay calm. You're not just a driver, are you? Asked a young woman trembling. Frank smiled. Once upon a time, no. Now I'm just in the right place at the right time. Frank bent down next to an elderly woman in the front seat. Ma'am, please reach into the inside pocket of my jacket. There's a small box there. Could you take it out? The elderly woman, astonished, reached into Frank's jacket and pulled out a small black box. Frank opened the box and took out a small device, an in-ear communication device, a device he had carried for years, charged every day, but never used. Thank you, said Frank, placing the device in his ear. Now please lie down and protect your head. Outside, the conflict was intensifying. There were now 4 Secret Service agents around the van, all armed, all on high alert. Frank pulled a small radio from his pocket, a device he had carried for 15 years but never used. Nighthawk here. 4 suspects, exact location Lancaster and Pine intersection. The president's vehicle is secure, but there are 72 civilians on the bus. Emergency evacuation required. A surprised voice came from the radio. Nighthawk. This code was deactivated 15 years ago. Who are you? Agent Frank Daniels, retired, Presidential Protection Unit. I left active duty in 2004. I'm now a bus driver and I have 72 civilians on my bus. Emergency evacuation required. A brief silence, then a firm command came through the radio. Understood, Nighthawk. Reinforcements en route. 30 seconds. Frank heard another voice from the device in his ear, deeper, more authoritative. Daniels, is that really you? Frank smiled slightly. Yes, Commander Stevens, this is Frank Daniels. God, Frank, where have you been for 15 years? I've been right here, sir. Always here. On duty. After a brief silence, Stevens asked, What's the situation? Frank quickly summarized. 4 armed attackers, a coordinated attack, probably other teams in the area. 72 civilians on the bus, all in danger. The presidential convoy currently stopped. The target still exposed. Understood, Frank. Teams will be there in 30 seconds. Evacuation protocol initiated for civilians. Just like the old days, Frank. Now tell me, is it safe for the convoy to move? Frank looked out the window, made a quick assessment. No, sir. The van still poses a threat, and there are probably other teams in the area. The safest option is for the convoy to maintain its current position. The bus is serving as a barrier between the van and the convoy. Understood, Frank. Teams are on the way. Hold on. Frank headed to the rear door of the bus. Without hesitation, as if he did it every day, he opened a hidden panel in the door mechanism. He pulled out a small device. All the passengers watched in amazement. What is that? Asked a young man. Emergency evacuation system, said Frank. Every city bus has one, but most drivers are unaware of its existence. This was a lie, of course. This system was Frank's personal design. 15 years ago, when he retired, he had obtained special permission to install this system on every bus. As a precaution, because Frank Daniels was always a cautious man. Ladies and gentlemen, said Frank in his calm voice, you will be evacuated through the rear door soon, in an orderly manner, without panic. There will be a protection team waiting for you. Follow their instructions. A young man asked, Who are you really? Frank smiled slightly. I'm just a bus driver, but once I was something else. Just then, black armored vehicles appeared on both sides of the bus. Secret Service agents, fully equipped, surrounded the bus in a professional formation. Frank opened the rear door and directed the evacuation of the passengers. Each one exited safely, quickly taken to a secure area by the protection teams. Frank returned to the front of the bus after the last passenger had safely exited. The conflict around the van was still ongoing. Frank approached the front window, carefully looked outside. The driver of the van and the man in the passenger seat were still resisting, but there was movement in the back. 2 more people trying to exit through the rear door. Frank quickly returned to the control panel of the bus. Stevens, there are 2 more people in the back. They're trying to escape. Understood, Frank. Teams are being notified. Frank saw the 2 men running towards a back alley in the rearview mirror. Secret Service agents immediately pursued them. The conflict intensified. The sound of gunfire became more frequent. And then, the man in the driver's seat of the van suddenly started running towards the bus. He had something in his hand. A small, black device. Frank instantly understood. A detonator. Explosive! Frank shouted into the radio. There's an explosive in the van! Evacuate now! Secret Service agents immediately began moving the president's vehicle away. Other agents were pulling civilians to a safe distance, but Frank had remained inside the bus. Frank, get out of there! Stevens shouted through the device in his ear. Get out now! Frank hesitated for a moment. Then he turned to the steering wheel, started the engine. No, Commander. There's still a job to do. Frank drove the bus towards the van, with full force directly into the center of the van. The impact knocked the man running towards the van to the ground, the detonator flying from his hand. Secret Service agents immediately neutralized the man. The bus was now leaning against the side of the van, both vehicles damaged. Frank slowly rose from the driver's seat. His head was bleeding, but he was conscious. He opened the door of the bus and stepped outside. The conflict ended within 10 minutes. 4 attackers were neutralized. The presidential convoy was safely removed from the area, and Frank stood alone beside his bus. One of the Secret Service agents approached him. He was a young man, perhaps in his 30s, with sharp features. Agent Daniels? I'm Agent Mitchell. I don't have the honor of knowing you, but I know your code. Nighthawk, from the President Carter era, right? Frank nodded. Reagan, Clinton, and Bush. 3 presidents, 26 years. Mitchell bowed his head respectfully. I had heard your legend, sir. The assassination attempt on President Reagan in 1981. You were there. Frank shrugged slightly. I was just doing my job, son. Mitchell asked, why did you become a bus driver, sir? Frank looked at his damaged bus. Because nobody pays attention to a bus driver, Agent Mitchell. And sometimes doing your duty without drawing attention is best. But why this route? Number 27? The same route for 15 years. Frank pulled out the old photograph from his pocket. Because this route passes through 3 important points. 5 kilometers east of the White House, 3 kilometers north of the Capitol building, and 7 kilometers south of the Pentagon. Strategically, it's the most critical route in the city. Mitchell looked at the photograph with respect. And for 15 years, you conducted surveillance on this route every day, all alone. I wasn't alone, said Frank. Every bus driver, every taxi driver, every mailman, we're all watching in some way. Some of us are just a bit more trained, a bit more experienced. In the hours that followed, Frank's story slowly emerged. He was one of the Secret Service's best agents. He had saved the lives of 3 presidents. In 1981, during John Hinckley Jr.'s assassination attempt on President Reagan, Frank was there. He was one of the agents protecting Reagan. In 1994, during the airplane attack on the White House, Frank led the team that carried President Clinton to the safe room. And in 2001, during the 9/11 attacks, Frank was part of the team that ensured President Bush was safely evacuated. In 2004, he was seriously injured during an assassination attempt and subsequently retired. But he had never truly retired. As part of a secret program, he was one of the sleeper agents placed on key transportation routes. On normal days, an ordinary bus driver. When needed, a protector acting with years of training and experience. Frank's story didn't appear in the evening news. It only said an accident was prevented thanks to the quick reflexes of an unknown bus driver. That's exactly what Frank wanted. He had never done this job to be recognized or applauded. The mission had always been more important than personal needs. Late at night, Frank returned home after receiving treatment at the hospital. The wound on his head had required a few stitches. The old wounds on his body had begun to ache again during today's struggle. But Frank was used to pain. During his 26 years of active duty, he had been shot twice, stabbed 3 times, and suffered countless bruises. These were the wounds that came with the profession. When he entered the living room of his house, the lights were on. He would normally always turn them off. Frank immediately went on alert, but then he saw the man sitting in his chair. "Stevens," said Frank with relief, "you scared me." Commander Stevens was a man in his 60s, with stern features and gray hair. He was one of the highest-ranking executives in the Secret Service, Frank's former boss, mentor, and perhaps his closest friend. 15 years, Frank," said Stevens, standing up. "We've been looking for you for 15 years. Frank took off his coat, quietly placed it on a chair. "If you had wanted to find me, you would have, Commander. I wasn't hiding." "A bus driver," said Stevens, laughing slightly. "Thousands of agents, hundreds of analyses, and you were just driving a bus." "The best way to hide is in plain sight," said Frank. "You taught me that." Stevens approached Frank, squeezed his shoulder. "You did a good job today, Frank, as always." "I was just doing my job, sir." "That job ended 15 years ago, Frank. You had retired." Frank smiled slightly. "Some missions never end, Commander. You taught me that too." Stevens remained silent for a moment, then nodded. "You're right, and that's why I have an offer for you." The next morning, there was a new driver on Route 27. Passengers wondered where their usual quiet driver was, but no one asked. The company had only made the explanation left for personal reasons. Frank Daniels was sitting in his modest apartment in Washington, D.C. His phone rang. It was the current president. "Mr. Daniels," said the president, "I don't know how to thank you." Frank smiled. "No need, Mr. President. I was just doing my job." "Were you on that route every day for 15 years? Just waiting?" "Each of us serves in different ways, sir. This was my way." The president paused for a moment. "I want you to come to the White House, a special ceremony for people like you." Frank politely declined. "Thank you, sir, but I don't like being in the spotlight. Is there another assignment for me?" A brief silence on the phone. Then, yes, Agent Daniels. Always. How about Route 28? Frank smiled. I'll be there at 6:30 tomorrow morning, sir. A week later, there was a new driver on Route 28, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a calm gaze. Passengers didn't pay much attention to him, just a pair of hands on the wheel, a pair of eyes on the road. But those eyes were always watching. Those hands were always ready to act. Because some missions never end. Some people never truly retire. Frank Daniels' new mission was to travel Route 28, a route stretching from the east of the Pentagon to the west of the White House, twice a day. But this time he wasn't alone. On different routes in the city, in different positions, there were dozens of retired agents. Some were bus drivers, some taxi drivers, some mailmen, some old men playing chess in the park. All watching carefully, all waiting, all ready. This program, called the Ghost Team by the Secret Service, never existed in official records. But every street in the city, every corner, every critical point was under observation. Frank and the others formed an invisible shield, silent, unobtrusive, but always alert protection network. Over time, Frank's story became a legend. Young agents learned about the Nighthawk case during training, how an agent had served on the same route every day for 15 years and at the most critical moment had saved a president's life. But Frank's name was never mentioned in these stories. He was only referred to as the retired agent. 6 months later, Frank was again on duty on Route 28. It was an ordinary day, a rainy Wednesday. The bus was half full, passengers absorbed in their phones, no one talking. Frank, as always, was quietly watching the road. At one stop, a middle-aged man boarded the bus. He looked ordinary. A brown jacket, black pants, a folded newspaper in his hand. But Frank's eyes immediately noticed the bulge under the man's jacket. A gun. Frank continued to remain calm. He watched the man in the rearview mirror. The man moved towards the back of the bus, sat in an empty seat. He made no eye contact with other passengers. He opened the newspaper, pretended to read, but Frank knew the man was actually scanning the surroundings. 2 stops later, another man boarded the bus. This time, Frank recognized him immediately. Agent Mitchell. He was in civilian clothes, but his posture, as always, was professional. Mitchell winked at Frank, then moved towards the middle of the bus, sitting a few seats ahead of the first man. Frank heard a voice from the small communication device in his ear. "Nighthawk, can you hear me?" The man in the back, Andrei Zakharov. Russian intelligence service. He might be conducting reconnaissance around the White House. Mitchell is dealing with him now. You just continue your normal route. Frank coughed slightly, a signal meaning understood. He continued to drive the bus at its normal speed, acting as if nothing had happened. But internally, he felt the excitement from the old days. Adrenaline was flowing through his veins. This was something he hadn't felt for a very long time. 5 stops later, Zakharov stood up, pressed the stop button. Frank stopped the bus at the station. Mitchell also stood up. The 2 men exited the bus at the same time. Frank watched in the rearview mirror. Mitchell was following Zakharov but maintaining a certain distance. "Good job, Nighthawk," said the voice in his ear. "Continue." And Frank, as always, continued his route, as if nothing had happened, calm, attentive, an invisible hero. 2 weeks later, a small news item appeared in the Washington Post. Russian intelligence agent expelled. The news stated that a Russian citizen named Andrei Zakharov had been expelled from the country due to behavior incompatible with diplomatic activities. After reading the news, Frank quietly smiled and folded the newspaper, throwing it in the trash. This was Frank Daniels' new life. Officially a retired bus driver, in reality a Secret Service agent, still on active duty. Every day the same route, the same stops, the same careful observation. Sometimes he would receive a signal from Stevens or Mitchell. Sometimes he would act on his own instincts. But always, in every situation, Frank Daniels was on duty. Because Frank knew very well that the world was never a safe place. There was always a threat. There always would be. And someone had to be the first line of defense against those threats. This was the role Frank had taken on for his entire life. Invisible, silent, but always there. A year later, Frank turned 65. He had reached the age of true retirement. Stevens organized a small ceremony for him. Just a few close friends, old colleagues, and of course Mitchell. Even at the ceremony, Frank was extremely uncomfortable. He had never done this job to be applauded or praised. 45 years, said Stevens, raising his glass. For 45 years, you've served this country, Frank. You saved the lives of 3 presidents. You prevented countless threats. And finally, you saved a bus full of civilians. You are a true hero. Frank shifted uncomfortably. I just did my job, Commander. Stevens laughed. Always the same answer. Always the same humility. That's why you're the best, Frank. After the ceremony, Frank and Mitchell stood outside quietly. Mitchell handed Frank an envelope. For you, sir. Frank opened the envelope. Inside was a bus driver ID for Route 29. Frank smiled. A new assignment? Mitchell nodded. Yes, sir. Number 29 passes by the new Congress building, a more sensitive area, more important. Frank put the ID in his pocket. I'll be there at 6:30 tomorrow morning. Mitchell bowed his head respectfully. I know, sir. And so Frank Daniels' journey continued. Every day a new route, every day a new mission, every day serving quietly, invisibly, because true heroes serve not for applause, but because it's the right thing to do. Their stories aren't written in books. Their names aren't mentioned on monuments. They are just there, always, whenever needed. One day, perhaps in a distant future, perhaps when Frank was no longer alive, a historian would discover and write his story. The story of the man who saved the lives of 3 presidents, then quietly continued to serve as a bus driver. But until then, Frank Daniels would just be known as the old driver of Route 29. And perhaps that's what he wanted most. What about you? Have you ever thought about who those quiet, ordinary people you encounter in daily life really are? Perhaps that old man sitting next to you once changed the world. Perhaps the driver of the bus you take every day is actually a hero. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories like this. Until our next story, take another look at the ordinary people around you, because nothing is as it seems.